You're 12 years old, you wake up, and today is the most important day of your life. Not because of a birthday party, not because of some exam, because today you're getting married. You don't choose who. You don't get asked. Someone older, probably much older, has already decided. The arrangement was made before you were old enough to understand what an arrangement was. And everyone around you, your parents, your village, your entire social world, thinks this is completely normal, expected even. Because in the world you were born into, this isn't strange, this is just how it goes. Now, that scenario feels wrong to us. Obviously, viscerally wrong, and it should. But here's the thing nobody asks when they encounter this piece of history. Why? Not just that it happened, but why did it happen? Across virtually every ancient civilization, on every continent, in every era of recorded human history, so consistently that it was essentially the default setting for most of our species' existence. Because the answer isn't simple. It isn't just ignorance. It isn't just cruelty. And understanding why it happened tells you something genuinely unsettling about the relationship between human values and the conditions that create them. It tells you something about what life actually looked like before the world we take for granted existed, before medicine, before safety nets, before the concept of childhood as we understand it was even invented. Because here's the part that most history books skip entirely. The concept of childhood, as a protected developmental stage that deserves shielding from adult obligations, is not ancient. It is not universal. It is not even particularly old. It is, historically speaking, a very recent idea, and the world that existed before it looked almost nothing like the world you grew up in. Let's start with the one factor that explains more than any other: life expectancy. Here's a number that most people know and almost nobody correctly understands. Average life expectancy in the ancient world was somewhere between 25 and 35 years, depending on the civilization and the era. And when people hear that, they picture a world where nobody lived past 35, where 30-year-olds were considered ancient, where surviving to 40 was a miracle reserved for the lucky few. That is not what it means. Not even close. Average life expectancy in the ancient world was crushed by one thing above everything else: infant and child mortality. The death rate for children under 5 was catastrophic by any modern standard. Depending on the time and place, somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. From infection, from famine, from contaminated water, from diseases we can cure today with a single prescription and a glass of water. The mathematics of averages does the brutal rest. If half your population dies at age 2, your average life expectancy collapses, even if the people who survive childhood go on to live into their 50s and 60s. And many of them did. Ancient Rome has extensive records of senators, generals, and philosophers living well past 60. Skeletal remains from prehistoric populations regularly show individuals who survived into their 50s. The idea that ancient people uniformly died young is a statistical artifact, not a biological reality. But here's where it matters directly for this story. Even if adults lived longer than the numbers suggest, the early years of life were genuinely precarious in ways we have almost entirely eliminated from modern experience. And that precariousness shaped everything: how families were structured, how economies were organized, what obligations children owed to parents, and yes, when people were expected to marry. If you knew, not feared but genuinely knew from direct daily experience, that a significant portion of the people around you would not survive their 20s, you would build your society around reproduction starting early. Not because you were monstrous, because you were doing arithmetic in a world that demanded it. Think about what a family in ancient Rome or ancient China or medieval Europe or pre-colonial West Africa actually needed to survive. Not thrive, just survive. Labor. Children who grew into workers who could farm the land, carry the trade goods, fight off the raiders, weave the cloth, and eventually care for aging parents in a world with no pension, no social safety net, no retirement system of any kind. Children were, in the most direct and entirely unsentimental sense, the only insurance policy that existed. They were the future labor supply, and the only guarantee that someone would be there to care for you when your body stopped working. And to have children who survived to adulthood in sufficient numbers, given the mortality rates, you had to start early. You had to have many, because you would lose some, probably several. Everyone knew this. It was simply the factual baseline of existence, before germ theory, before antibiotics, before clean water infrastructure, before any of the systems that have quietly made modern life so different from every era that preceded it. This is not a comfortable framing, but it is an honest one. Now let's add a second layer. Because survival logic alone doesn't fully explain early marriage across every culture. Something else was almost always operating alongside it. Something that had nothing to do with children and everything to do with power. In ancient societies, marriage was almost never about the two people getting married. That understanding of marriage, as a choice between two individuals based on mutual affection and personal compatibility, is a remarkably recent and culturally specific invention. For most of human history across most of the world, marriage was a contract between families, between clans, between kingdoms. It was a legal, economic, and political instrument for transferring property, consolidating land, sealing alliances, ending conflicts, and binding the competing interests of powerful groups to one another in a way that everyone had to honor. In that context, the age of the people being married was essentially beside the point. What mattered was the agreement. A 12-year-old daughter of a Roman senator was not, primarily, a 12-year-old girl. She was an asset, a political instrument, a seal on a contract between families whose interests needed to be aligned. The earlier the contract was signed, the longer the alliance held. The younger the girl, the more years of her reproductive potential were captured by the arrangement. From the perspective of the families negotiating, waiting longer introduced risk. The girl might die. Circumstances might change. A better offer might appear on the other side of the table. Moving fast was rational. In a brutal, cold, entirely unsentimental way. Rational. And this is the part that's genuinely hard to sit with. The people making these decisions were not, in most cases, indifferent to their daughter's well-being. Ancient literature is full of parental grief, parental love, parental anguish. Fathers in ancient Rome wrote poems about their daughters that would not look out of place on a modern greeting card. They loved their children with the same ferocity that parents love children today. But love does not automatically produce protection in the form we recognize. What you protect someone from depends entirely on what you understand as a threat, what options you actually have, and what framework of rights exists to operate within. In a world where a girl had no legal standing independent of her family, where her future security was entirely dependent on being married well, the most loving thing her father believed he could do was secure a good arrangement as early and as firmly as possible. The cruelty was not personal. It was structural. And that distinction matters enormously if you want to actually understand it, rather than just condemn it. Let's talk about what the law actually said across different civilizations, because the variation is more complicated than most people expect. In ancient Rome, the legal minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These numbers were not arbitrary. They were loosely tied to the concept of puberty as the threshold for marriage eligibility, a framework borrowed from earlier Greek medical traditions that associated physical maturity with reproductive readiness. Not emotional readiness, not psychological development, not anything resembling modern concepts of adolescent growth, just the biological capacity to bear children. But here is what the Roman legal record also shows, and this is almost always left out of the conversation. Even within a society that explicitly permitted marriage at 12, actual marriage at that age was not the uniform norm. Upper-class Roman girls typically married in their mid to late teens. Girls from poorer households or in politically urgent situations might marry younger. The law established a floor. Practice varied enormously based on class, wealth, geography, and immediate circumstances. The same pattern holds across most ancient legal frameworks. The formal permission to marry young coexisted with significant practical variation. A wealthy family with stable land holdings, no immediate political crisis, and several healthy sons had far less pressure to rush their daughters into marriage than a family managing debt, military threat, or a succession dispute that needed resolving before the next harvest season. Ancient Greece presents a different picture again. In Athens, girls typically married between 14 and 18, often to men significantly older, sometimes by decades. The age gap was not accidental, it was structural. Men were expected to establish themselves economically before marrying. Women were expected to be young, controlled, and transferred from the authority of a father directly into the authority of a husband, with minimal interruption between the two. The idea of a girl having an independent period between those two states was simply absent from the conceptual framework entirely. Sparta famously was different. Spartan girls trained physically were married later than their Athenian counterparts, and the reasoning was entirely practical. Spartan society determined that stronger, older girls produced stronger children, and strong children who survived to become soldiers were the only output that Spartan civilization cared about producing. Different survival logic, different outcome. Even within the same ancient world, the variation was real. In ancient China, formal betrothals could be arranged in childhood, sometimes in infancy, but cohabitation typically began later. The betrothal secured the agreement. The marriage activated it, often years down the line. In ancient India, similar structures existed. Child betrothal as a legal and social instrument was widespread, but the age at which it became a physical reality varied considerably across region, caste, and economic circumstance. In medieval Europe, canon law set the minimum age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, mirroring the Roman precedent. But again, what the law permitted and what actually happened routinely diverged. Among the nobility, where marriage was almost entirely a political instrument, young betrothals were common precisely because the political stakes were highest and the need to lock in alliances most urgent. Among common people, with fewer assets to transfer and less political consequence attached to the match, marriage often happened later simply because there was less urgency driving it forward. There is also a medical dimension to this history that rarely gets the attention it deserves, because ancient physicians were not uniformly silent on the subject. The Roman physician Soranus, writing in the 2nd century AD, documented explicitly and in clinical detail the physical dangers of early pregnancy. He described the damage done to undeveloped pelvic structures. He recorded the elevated mortality rates of very young mothers during childbirth. He argued, in language that was careful and methodical and entirely serious, that early marriage was medically harmful and that the practice should be delayed for the physical protection of the girls involved. He was not alone. Similar concerns appear in ancient Indian Ayurvedic texts. In medieval Islamic legal scholarship, debates existed about the appropriate age for the consummation of marriage that were grounded at least partly in medical concern for the girl's physical survival. In Chinese medical literature, analogous arguments were made about the dangers of early childbearing. The critique of very early marriage from a medical standpoint is almost as old as the practice itself. These voices did not win. The political, economic, and cultural pressures sustaining early marriage were simply more powerful than the medical arguments against it. And more fundamentally, the concept of a girl's individual well-being as a value that could override family interest or political necessity had no framework to stand on. Rights require a system of rights to be meaningful. In a world where that system didn't exist, the arguments that depended on it couldn't gain traction regardless of how clearly the harm was articulated. But they tried. They documented. They pushed. And in doing so, they created the earliest thread of a conversation that would take nearly 2,000 more years to produce anything resembling a legal resolution. There is one more dimension to this that almost never appears in the mainstream historical account: the question of what these girls actually experienced, as distinct from what was done to them legally and politically. The historical record on this is fragmentary, partial, and almost entirely filtered through voices that were not theirs. Women in most ancient civilizations did not write the histories. They did not leave legal records. Their letters, where they exist at all, survive in tiny numbers and mostly from the upper class. The texture of what it felt like to be a 12-year-old girl handed into marriage in ancient Rome, ancient China, or medieval France is something we can only approach obliquely, through exceptional cases, through the rare first-person account, through the silences in records that were never designed to include them. What we can say is that the experience was not uniform. Some marriages were, by the accounts we have, relatively humane. Some were not. Some girls were treated with genuine care by older husbands who understood the gap in age and power and attempted to be patient. Some were not. The variation in individual experience was probably as wide as the variation in individual character, which is to say, very wide indeed. What was nearly universal was the absence of choice. The decision was not hers. The negotiation was not hers. The outcome was not hers to refuse. And that absence of agency, regardless of how any specific marriage turned out, is the thing that cuts through every other variable and sits at the center of this history. Now let's sit with the largest question. Not just why it happened, but why it ended. Because it did end. Gradually, unevenly, bitterly contested at every stage. But it ended. And the forces that dismantled early marriage are as instructive as the forces that built it. The most powerful single factor was the collapse of child mortality. As medicine improved, as clean water became available, as vaccines arrived, as basic nutrition stabilized, the brutal actuarial logic that had made early marriage a survival strategy stopped applying. when children were no longer expected to die in large numbers, when a woman could realistically expect to survive childbirth, when you didn't need 6 children to ensure 2 survived into adulthood, the demographic pressure to begin reproduction at 12 simply evaporated. The survival calculation changed, and marriage practice followed it. Alongside that came the economic transformation. As economies industrialized, as they shifted from agricultural to wage labor to professional, children stopped being economic assets in the direct and immediate way they had been. Education became more valuable than early field labor. A daughter who could read, calculate, and eventually earn independently represented a different kind of family resource than a daughter who could be married at 12 into a neighboring family's land. Delaying marriage to allow for schooling produced better long-term economic outcomes. The same logic that had once demanded early marriage now demanded the opposite. And then, slowly, contested at every step, came the idea that children, including girls, have individual rights that exist independently of their usefulness to the family, the political arrangement, or anyone else's interest. That a girl's own development, her own future, her own body, constitute claims on the world that cannot simply be overridden by what a father or a king or a contract requires. That idea is not ancient, it is not self-evident, it is not even fully realized today, in every country for every girl. But it is the idea that changed everything. And it is newer than most people want to believe. The international legal standard placing the minimum age for marriage at 18 exists because generations of people argued, legislated, documented harm, and refused to stop pushing. It did not arrive because humanity matured naturally or because obvious moral clarity eventually won out. It arrived because specific people in specific moments made specific arguments and kept making them until the weight of evidence and advocacy became impossible to ignore. Which means it is not guaranteed. It is not permanent. It is not the inevitable endpoint of some arc of progress that bends automatically toward justice. It is a position that was won and that has to be maintained. So here is what this history actually asks of you. Not condemnation of the past. Not a comfortable sense of moral superiority over people who lived in conditions you have never faced and cannot fully imagine. What it asks is something harder. It asks you to look at the values you hold and ask which ones are genuinely yours, and which ones are simply a product of the conditions you were born into. Ancient parents loved their daughters and arranged their marriages at 12, not because they were monsters, because they were operating inside a world that made that feel like love, inside a framework of mortality and economics and political necessity that left almost no room for any other calculation. The world changed, the framework changed, and slowly, imperfectly, the behavior changed with it. You live on the other side of that change. Most humans throughout history did not. Whatever you do with that, it is not a small thing to understand.